Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Devlogs session. So, for today's session, we will take a look at Tailwind and we will compare the pros and cons of Tailwind. And yeah, I guess let's get into it. First is what is Tailwind? So, Tailwind is a new way of implementing CSS. Essentially, it has been making rounds in the software engineering world where and there's two side of the coin. Essentially, there's a lot of people who like Tailwind because of the benefits that it brings, and another side where they don't see why it's so well known. So let's go through their website first and what is their selling point of Tailwind. So they have a real-time demo here where you can see on the left side they are just keying in a couple of class names that changes this component here on the left side. You can see, I think, yeah, so centering it, changing it here, making it flex, putting on the left side. They're changing it to the height. So in a couple of seconds, they were able to completely change the style. So this is even mobile responsive. So in a couple of seconds, they were able to make the component completely different from one another, changing the whole styling with just a few changes of this class. So it at first glance, it kind of looks very weird to understand if you're not familiar with Tailwind, like W-24, H-24, PT-6. And so I think like let's go through the pros and cons of the Tailwind. But first, why we would do it? Why would you use it? If you were watching my previous devlog, I was talking about micro SaaS and startups. And Tailwind for me has been one of the fastest way to develop styling. And if you are familiar with previous ways of doing it, is usually you say create a style in a separate CSS file and then you tag your component. So there is a layer of abstraction here where you, rather than typing everything here as a part of the class, you would put it as a separate CSS ID and then you would just put it here. But essentially when you change it, you would go back and forth to that CSS style, that CSS class, and then going back and forth to the file. So there's a abstraction between the HTML file, the CSS, and then how it actually use or how it actually looks. A more modern way of doing it, aside from Tailwind, is Bootstrap CSS. So Bootstrap essentially comes out of the box with ready built components that you just copy paste. So this is the more more famous in bigger organizations. So essentially they have out of the box ready components that people just copy from, and then their designers would tweak it, and then you would have your own Bootstrap component. So this is an alternative of Tailwind. But for me, as a full stack or more focused on the back end, Tailwind allows me to build things much faster. And I think we're diving into the pros and cons here now. So the pros is it allows you to essentially have a fast iteration. So you can see in on the demo itself from their website, they were just tweaking some of the class names there, and it was able to, and even just the act of typing it, like if you want to have with full or with 64, W dash number or 64 allows you to already implement that change without finding what file was, finding what CSS class it was, CSS ID it was, and real time change it, and you can see without having to dive into the code. So I think that is the main selling point of Tailwind. Another selling point of Tailwind is how copy pastable it is. I don't know if that's a word, but essentially you can it acts like Bootstrap as well. So if I Google, say, navbar Tailwind, so there are sites that actually give you already made components as well, like similar to Bootstrap. So for example, here, this is how it would look like. This is how it would look like. So several things with different components ready to go. You can essentially copy paste this whole thing, and you can more or less expect that it will exactly look the same as this one, and you don't need to you don't need to change it in other files. So if for example you have a nav file, you don't need to copy paste, say, this div here, and then the CSS changes there, and configure this. It's all encapsulated in one file. So for me, especially if you're building a micro SaaS, it helps speed up a lot of the development process, where I don't need to figure out what I need to change. I just need a good looking navbar. And essentially, I also talked about this one in my previous devlog. But once you have a snippet of, so this is where I build up all my asset library, so I don't have to keep doing all the things. And so I highly recommend having your own asset library, especially if you're doing plumbing, as I call it, plumbing in your applications, where you keep constantly building things. So once you have a component that you already know, for example, here, I build this myself, and I can just copy paste the whole thing over and over again. I don't need to build it. I don't need to constantly build it from scratch. So if I copy paste this whole thing, I can be fairly certain that it will more or less look the same. And so I've been building certain components that always look consistent. So customer review page, bottom nav, and this helps you compound whatever you're building as your library grows, as you build more things. So I have several parts of the applications here, as like infrastructure, backend stuff. So if you're interested in looking it up, it's snippets.melchortatlonghari.com. So that is the two main things I would say why why I really like using Tailwind. But there are obviously, like in software engineering, it's always about trade-offs. So the trade-offs here is something you need to be cautious about when diving into a new technology. No technology is a silver bullet. So in any language that you use, in any framework, architecture, in any technology, there will always be trade-off. If it was the perfect software, then everyone would just use it. No, there would be no other alternatives. This is why we have Bootstrap versus Tailwind. We have Java versus Go. We have Python. We have all sorts of different languages, all sorts of different frameworks, because there is always a trade-off. And depending on what your need is, you weigh the pros and cons of each. And so similarly, you also have those pros and cons in Tailwind. So the main con of Tailwind, I would say, is the learning curve, because Tailwind relies on convention versus configuration, rather than having the need to have a lot of configuration. Their convention is, you need to learn their convention or their way of working with CSS. So if you go back to their site, these are their conventions with regards to CSS. So P is padding, for example. So rather than using, or when you're writing about padding, you think about P. And so it's more that learning curve of figuring out what their convention is versus what is common knowledge. And I think that is something that you also need to do otherwise when you're learning new technology, but more so in Tailwind, because most of the Tailwind, or how you use Tailwind, is a lot on their convention. So you have to actually figure out what are the things that you need to know. And it gets easy, to be honest. Once you keep using Tailwind, once you get over that initial hump of figuring out what P stands for, what W stands for, what are these shorthand versions of Tailwind, it becomes much smoother to use. So only at the beginning it might be a bit hard to figure out those conventions, but it will become easier, and once you master it, it becomes much faster. And then finally, the last con that I wanted to talk about is how files or how your component starts to become convoluted, because when you start introducing more complex styling, so in their site you can see it's a bit short actually. What their styling was pretty straightforward. They only had like a couple of things, but I'll show you in my actual code. I was building, so what is this bit? This is, I think, actually even like having a gradient. So this is the side I was telling you about, the your SAS. So excuse me. So even like, for example, building this sign up button where there's a gradient and there's a shadow on hover effect and things like this, a more complex CSS styling, you you wouldn't be surprised with how long the class would look like. So this is, I've put some line breaks in here, but usually it could also stretch all the way to the end, and it's very hard to read if there's a lot of styling involved here. So that's a caveat here, and it might also not be translatable. So when you try to copy paste it in other components, like you would have to copy the whole thing. I highlighted there is a workaround here. So I have styles here that I consistently reuse. So for example, my container, here's these stuff. So tweet page, full page, essentially adding it as a constant. And then on my page, so this is where I use some of my main styles. So in the class name, I have styles, and it just calls those Tailwind class names. And then so it's much cleaner in my eyes, but just be mindful or conscious that it kind of defeats the purpose of it. I feel like it's backwards to what Tailwind was intended, but for me it was a bit getting too much with all the styling. It was too dirty to look at. It was a bit harder to read with all those styling that I couldn't figure out like some of the divs where it fits. So I resorted into chunking it like so. So for example, in this part, in my header, I would just add full row span plus header plus primary color scheme. Whereas in this section, I have different styles, and each of in itself, each class is each styles would have their own CSS styling, so I can just combine them together same way as I would do in normal situation. But yeah, so it depends on what your preference are. For me, it's, even though there were some cons working with Tailwind, I think this has still been the fastest way for me to spin up SaaS or SaaS applications left and right. And I'll show you. I've been building a couple of things. I show you this in a previous devlog, but so Product Hunt is where you can launch your own startups, your applications, and have feedback from potential users. But so say for example, it allowed me to launch 4 applications in 2 months, right? So again, pros and cons. You need to weigh if speed is your primary concern, then I would definitely recommend using Tailwind. But yeah, there is a learning curve at the beginning, so it's really up to you if you're curious about it. But definitely recommended. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it for Tailwind pros and cons. I would definitely appreciate it if you like, comment, subscribe, or if you have any questions, drop a comment below. And yeah, thank you for watching. Peace.